All right, good evening. We are ready for the end of Acts 22, and glad that we can be together tonight. And boy, the crowd looks so much better than it did last week at this time. So
I'll probably feel better than you did last week at this time too.
And that's no commentary on the people who were here last week. You look
right.
You look just as bad as you did then. So just kidding, mostly.
All right, so
Acts 22. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so just in a way of review here. So Paul has gone back to Jerusalem. What did he go back to Jerusalem for? Yeah, to take the collection to the needy saints in Judea. And while he's there, the elders of the church of Jerusalem say, hey, you know what? There's a reputation that you have that you're teaching the Jews not to follow the customs of Moses. And so what you can do in order to not have this hindering your influence in teaching the gospel is we have some men that have taken a vow, and if you will go to the temple and pay their vow expenses, then everybody will see that these are false reports that they're hearing. So Paul goes to the temple, and while he's at the temple with these men, someone recognizes him from Asia and makes a false charge against him. What's the false charge? Yeah, he brought a Gentile into the temple. And how did the people respond by that? They grab him and start trying to kill him, beat him to death. Well, the Romans who are stationed in the fortress of Antonia looking over in this, see this mob taking place. And so they run down and they grab Paul, pulling him away from them, chain him up, and begin to lead him away back up to the barracks here and to question him. They don't know exactly what's going on here. When they get to the top of the stairs, what does Paul want to do? I would like to speak to them. And there's some confusion there. Well, aren't you this Egyptian who led a bunch of assassins out in the wilderness? No, I'm not. And so, okay, all right, so you can speak to him. So Paul speaks in the Hebrew language, and he begins to talk to the Jews that are gathered there. By the way, when he speaks to them in Hebrew language, they listen. What is the core of his message? What does he do?
Basically tells how he actually became an apostle. And while he's doing that, they're all right because he's talking about when he used to be like one of them after the way.
Yeah.
And nobody's asking any questions because everybody understands what he's talking about. But when he starts talking about teaching the Gentiles, that's when the uproar.
Yep, he said the word Gentiles. They stopped listening, and once again, and they began to shout what? Away with this fellow! He's not fit to live on the face of the earth. So the Romans drag him back into the barracks, into the safety of the barracks there, and it's at that point. Let's see. I think that's where we left off, right?
Yep.
And so that's where we will pick up the new material today.
Yeah, so in verse 25, when they had stretched him out for the whips, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned?" So you could flog somebody who is not a Roman citizen without a trial. You cannot do that sort of thing to someone who has Roman citizenship. That was one of the rights of citizenship. And the way Roman citizenship worked is that there were people, originally it was people who were born in the city of Rome got citizenship. And then it was people who were born on the island, or on the peninsula of Italy. And then over time, the Romans would extend that citizenship to different cities that they would conquer as a privilege, maybe because they sided with them during a war, or because they had helped them in some kind of military campaign, or something like that. And we're going to see here that people were able to receive that citizenship in different ways. But what came with that citizenship was, if you were willing, you would be able to go and vote in some of the Roman elections. Very few people who lived outside of Rome or Italy actually traveled to Rome to vote in those elections, but you could. You had certain legal rights, like you could appeal your court case up the ladder, and we'll see that later in the book of Acts. But one of the things is that there were certain things you could not just be beaten or condemned without a fair trial. That was one of the privileges of being a Roman citizen. And so here Paul is stretched out there ready to beat him, and he says, "Are you allowed to treat Roman citizens this way?" Which would have, kind of caused a shock to the person who was getting ready to whip him.
Yeah. So in verse 26, when the centurion heard that he went and told the commander, saying, "Take care what you do, for this man is a Roman." And then the commander came and said, "Tell me, are you a Roman?" And Paul said, "Yes." Then the commander answered and said, "With a large sum of money I obtained this citizenship." And Paul says, "I was born a citizen." And so, in other words, Paul had been a citizen longer. He'd obtained it in a more noble means. In other words, he wasn't someone that had to purchase it. He was actually born as a citizen of Rome. And so then immediately those who were about to examine him withdrew from him, and the commander was also what? Afraid. I want you to pay attention to that. He was afraid when he found out that he was a Roman because he had bound him. When they initially grab Paul and chain him up, who do they think he is? A Jew. Actually, an Egyptian, right? He said, "Are you not the Egyptian who some time ago raised up an insurrection and led 1,000 assassins out into the wilderness?" 1,000. Where did I get that from? 4,000. So that's who they originally think he is. No, that's not me. Oh, okay. But it's only at this point that he realizes this guy's a Roman citizen. Have they been treating him like a Roman citizen up to this point? No. In the way that they arrested him, in the way that they're trying to examine him to get some confession out of him, they have not. This is serious charges. Their job, the Romans' job, were to protect the Roman Empire and the Roman citizens. And now he's ended up mistreating a Roman citizen. He could answer for this, so he's afraid. I want you to pay attention to how this plays out, because what ends up happening is that God uses the circumstances that are taking place to actually protect Paul's life. Paul is going to get some privileges, probably because of his initial mistreatment here. That's almost like he's trying to kind of make up for some things, or at least save his own neck. Not save Paul's neck, but the commander save his own neck for what's happened at this point. So just kind of watch as that plays out. Any comments or thoughts from anybody? I assume so. There were a lot of different insurrections at this time that were raising up. There were a lot of different ones who were claiming to be messiahs, because you remember the Jews recognized the fullness of time had come. In other words, this was the time when the Messiah was supposed to come. So there were a lot of false prophets being raised up that were leading, and then there were also a lot of people who were calling for the downfall or the overturn of the Roman Empire. And so there were a lot of things like that taking place. I'm not familiar with that particular insurrection, and Josephus may have written about it. I don't know. I'm not that studied on Josephus. But I assume that it was a current event, and that this must have been what maybe they were on guard for, and they saw something and made assumptions there. Anybody else?
So as the commander is still trying to figure out what's going on, because whether he's a Roman citizen or not, if he's causing an uproar in the city that's going to cause a threat to the peace, he needs to know what's going on here. So verse 30, on the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he still hadn't figured it out. And even if he could understand Hebrew and was able to listen to that sermon, I don't think you could have picked out what the problem was just from what Paul had said. Even when you notice that, lo, I turn to go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles, I don't know that he would have been able to pick up on the very specific problem that the Jews are having with him in this case. And so he sends him, he unbounds him and sends him, commanded the chief priests and all the council to meet, and he brought Paul down and set him before them. So this council that's meeting, this is the Sanhedrin Council. If I read today that it was about 71 men, including the high priest. And former high priests would have been on this, and elders of the people. These would have been highly respected, authoritative people on the law. And they were the highest Jewish authority when it came to politics and judgments and the laws of the Jewish people. And so the Romans convene this council so that they can get a clear understanding of what's going on in this situation. And so Paul is going to take advantage of this opportunity and talk to the highest council. probably that he was on a fast track to be a part of at one point. And so he would be familiar with many of these people, I'm sure, as he stands before them and talks to them.
Would anybody like to guess what Paul will probably say if he gets an audience with this group? He is going to say that. What would, based upon past experience, what do you think he's going to try to do? Teach them the gospel. That's exactly right. And he opens his mouth, and it says in verse 1, Paul looked earnestly at the council and said, "Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day." And I suspect where he's going with this is he's going to retell the story again of how he thought he was doing right, but then he found out he was doing wrong, because that's what they need to hear. They think they're doing right, but they're not. And he's going to try to present that. However, he doesn't get an opportunity to, because verse 2 says, "And the high priest, Ananias, commanded those who stood by him to strike him on his mouth." And so, whap! That's how you shut somebody up when you don't want to hear what they say. And so Paul gets struck by this. By the way, this Ananias, I have in my notes here that he was high priest from 48 to 59 AD. And he was assassinated in 59 AD. Keep that in mind, because we're probably around 57, 58 right here at this time. So he's only a couple years from getting assassinated. He commands Paul to be struck. Verse 3, Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. For you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law?" And now, if we know that in a year and a half to 2 years, Ananias is going to be assassinated, what does it sound like Paul's saying here? Sounds like he's speaking prophecy by inspiration. And this is a really confusing passage for me. Larson's going to help us out with the understanding of this. But Paul says this pretty strong here. "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall." To which those who stood by, verse 4 said, "Do you revile God's high priest?" And Paul answers and said, "I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people." So, Larson.
Yeah. So let's go back for 1 second to verse 2. Why would what Paul said in verse 1 deserve being struck on the mouth in verse 2? He says, "I've lived my life in good conscience," which is like, I don't know, something we would expect of most people, right? I try to do what I think's right. Slaps him on the mouth. Why? What is Paul saying in that? Yeah. So, if Paul says, "I have always done what was right before God, and now I'm doing something different than what you people are doing," well, I think that now they stand condemned, right? And so he's saying, when I was serving as a Jew, I was doing what I knew was right before God. Now that I'm following Jesus, I'm doing what I know is right. And that means that you, who are supposed to be the most spiritually minded people, the most knowledgeable about the Scriptures, about the things relating to God, you're not doing that. So Ananias has him slapped. Now, then Paul brings down this curse on him. "How dare you? God will strike you, you whitewashed wall." He calls him a hypocrite, which Jesus was not unwilling to say about people like Ananias and his followers. So that doesn't seem that far out of character with what Jesus would have said about somebody like the high priest, that he was a hypocrite and a whitewashed wall. And then you have the people around who say, "I can't believe you said that about the high priest." And so you have Paul's response. So there are a couple of options. I'm not going to tell you which one's right because I don't know. But I will tell you what I think.
I could have given options.
Yeah. I'll tell you what I think is right. Well, what I would like to be right, whether it is or not. So, which is always good, right? You always want the Bible class teacher to say, "This is what I'd like to be right, whether it is or not." So one option is Paul really didn't know it was the high priest. And there are a couple of factors, I think, that could have led to that. Paul has only been to Jerusalem pretty intermittently over the last 6 years that Ananias has been high priest. It may very well be that he has bad eyesight. It may be that he really doesn't know who Ananias is, that when somebody speaks and has him ordered to be slapped, Paul responds. Kind of in contrast to that is the fact that Ananias is struck down. And it seems like Paul is speaking very clearly about this specific person. Another thing, another option is that Paul knew who it was, says this in response, and then says, "You're right. I went too far in that response." Maybe that's possible. I don't know. I like the option that maybe he's responding with a little bit of irony here. Like, "Oh, I didn't know he was the high priest because I could not have imagined the high priest doing something like that." Right? That if he would have acted more like a high priest, maybe I would have known not to speak ill of a ruler of the people. But since he is acting like a whitewashed wall, sorry, didn't know it was the high priest because he's not really acting like one. So maybe that has something to do with it. I think there is. I think in this what we see, especially with Paul's initial statement, is that this is something that is that. So what Paul is trying to indicate by saying that is that these people pretend to be keepers of the law. If Paul is really legitimately apologizing here and saying, "You're right, the law says I ought not to have done that," then he shows himself to be more willing to bend to the law than they are. And I think that may be what's going on here. In any case, Paul is saying, you sit in judgment of the law, and yet you're not willing to yield to it when it shows you're wrong. I am doing that. I realize my mistake here, if that's what's happening here. So there's some options.
Any other thoughts? All right, so at this point, now just think about what's transpired over the last couple of days. Paul has tried to explain himself the day before. He's tried to get an audience here to explain himself. How's it gone both times? Does it look like he's probably going to get a fair hearing here? No. And I think at this point he realizes that, and so he says, all right, there's no point in me wasting my time trying to explain this to him. And so what he does is he perceives in verse 6 that part were Sadducees and part were Pharisees. The Sanhedrin council was an interesting council because it was made up. Matter of fact, the high priest for most years were Sadducees. And most of the ones who were in the upper part of the Sanhedrin council were Sadducees. But the Pharisees made up the majority of the council. And so you always had tension between these two different religious sects in the Sanhedrin. Paul is aware of that. He realizes that he's not going to get any justice here. So he just uses what he knows about them and what he knows about himself. And he says, "Men and brethren, I'm a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead, I'm being judged." All right, I will try to compare this to something that maybe we have very strong emotional feelings about, that we think there's a right or a wrong. Can you imagine, here's a group of people, and some of them are pro-life and some of them are pro-choice. And they feel very strongly about that, but they have been trying to work together in something, and now they have come in judgment over this person, and this person says, well, I'll tell you what, I am pro-life, and the reason that I'm even called into question today is because of my beliefs on abortion, that I believe that that's wrong and that children have a right to live. How would half of them immediately feel towards this person? Compassion. This is one of us. This is a good guy here. And how would the other half feel? Oh boy, this is terrible. But now what's happened is it's no longer everybody looking at him saying we're going to judge him. Now it's suddenly them looking at each other. The differences have been pointed out. So what Paul does is he brings up, by the way, was Paul being judged for his hope in the resurrection? Yeah, he was. He was. But he brings up the Pharisee part, particularly because he knows that, and it is funny how this works. Look, when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection or an angel or a spirit, but the Pharisees say both, confess both. Then there arose a loud outcry, and the scribes who were of the Pharisees' party arose, protested, and saying, we find no evil in this man. But if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God. In other words, he's good. He's fine. I don't know. He hasn't done anything wrong. Just over that one issue. And that's how strongly they felt about that issue. Paul knew they felt that strongly about the issue, so he brought it up and creates this division among them in this. But it's interesting how quickly they bite on it.
Yeah, so in this situation, emotions run hot, and the Tribune is afraid that Paul is going to be torn to pieces as a result of this argument that has happened. And so they bring him back to the barracks. I assume that he is still very unclear about what's going on. He's trying to figure out what's happening here. And then Paul begins speaking, and the assembly nearly tears itself apart over the one thing this guy does say. And so you would have to imagine that this commander is getting pretty frustrated about trying to figure out what the exact circumstances are. In verse 11, the following night the Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." So going back to chapter 19 and verse 21 was one of the first places where we read that Paul had intentions on going to Rome. 19 and verse, let me flip over there for just a moment. Now after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem, saying, "After I've been there, I must also see Rome." Maybe in the Spirit, I take that to be that he has revelation that this is what's going to happen, that he's going to see Rome. Does he know how it's going to happen at that point? I don't think so. Because so now when we come to chapter 23, you must also testify in Rome. There are several places along the way in the book of Acts where the Lord speaks to Saul directly to provide courage. I think about Acts 18 when he's in Corinth, and he gives him a special word of encouragement that I have many people in this city. Don't be afraid. And now here in another place where he's facing severe opposition, maybe it's in doubt. Am I even going to make it to Rome? Take courage. I'll be with you. So, you made mention about keeping in mind his citizenship and how the Lord uses that along the way. I want you to keep in mind this promise in chapter 23, verse 11, where God says, "You will testify in Rome." There's going to be some pretty sorry things that happen to Paul between here and the end of the book. Paul can consistently keep in mind, I'm going to see Rome. So when it looks like things are going to all come to naught, he rests on God's promise, and we're going to see a little bit of that in this next paragraph, I think, and it'll be instructive for us.
Which is a really good point. I like you bringing that up because we've got some promises that God's promised us. Mm-hmm. And many times it seems like that those promises take a lot longer than we would expect them to take. And we surely didn't expect this to happen, if that's going to happen. And we really have to have that same type of confidence. Well, you know what? God said this is going to happen, and so I've got to trust Him on that. So that's a great point. Any other thoughts before we get into this next section?
Yeah. So when you look at verse 12, when it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by oath neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. You would imagine that would be a pretty serious problem for the promise of verse 11. But then you remember, it's God who's the one who makes the promise. And so a bunch of Jews deciding they're not going to eat or sleep until they killed Paul, eat or drink. Maybe they would have slept, I don't know. Is not going to matter very much in the grand scheme of things.
So how many were there that decided that they would not eat or drink or sleep? More than 40. That's a lot who said, look, this is number one priority for us. Nothing will come before this. We will see him dead, and we will see him dead shortly. And so they bind themselves together, and they come to the chief priest and the elders, and they said, "We have bound ourselves under a great oath." By the way, how seriously did the Jews take their oaths? Very seriously. As a matter of fact, they had just so that if there was someone who didn't take the oath seriously, they had all kinds of special rules about oaths because that was a big deal. So we bound ourselves under a great oath that we will eat nothing until we have killed Paul. Now here's the plan. You therefore, together with the council, suggest to the commander that he be brought down to you tomorrow, as though you were going to make further inquiries concerning him. But we are ready to kill him before he comes near. So here's the plan. We've all promised that we're going to kill him, and we're not going to eat or drink until we've killed him. We need your help. You just call for him. You don't have to be responsible for this in any way except to send for him. We'll make sure he never gets here. That's the plan. More than 40 of them. Now, it's interesting because in verse 16, when Paul's sister's son heard of their ambush, he went and entered the barracks and told Paul, which makes you wonder, how did he hear about this? I don't know, but I do know that Paul's family, at least Paul, he had significant influence among Jewish leadership before he became a Christian. Remember, he could go to the high priest and get letters from the high priest to go and do so. And so his family has some connections there. For him to even study at the feet of Gamaliel, I understand, would have been a pretty, he would have had to be in an pretty important position or have some pull to be able to do that. So his sister, apparently her family, has some connections with at least those that would be involved in this, enough for her son, his nephew, to know about this.
Yeah, and in verse 17, Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him." Now, what's the promise back up in verse 11? You will see Rome. Verse 17, Paul takes his nephew and sends him to the centurion to make sure that he knows about this plot to kill him. Paul did not take God's promise to mean that he shouldn't take precautionary measures. I think that's maybe a helpful lesson. There are certain promises that God has made, but that does not mean that we just mail it in and we say, well, God said this is going to happen. I'll just see what happens. But rather, Paul was willing to take precautionary measures to protect his own life. And so verse 18, so he took him, brought him to the tribune, and said, Paul, the prisoner, called me and asked me to bring this young man to you as he has something to say to you. The tribune took him by the hand and going aside asked him privately, what is it you have to tell me? And he said, the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more closely about him. But do not be persuaded by them. For more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him, who have bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for your consent. So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, tell no one that you have informed me of these things. So I think there are several things at work here. I think the primary thing at work here is God's providence, is that all of this would be in this situation. Part of that providence would be the connection that whatever that is that Paul's nephew has. But part of it is probably his citizenship and the fact that the tribune would go to any effort whatsoever to protect him, that he would be willing to take this statement from this young man to try to figure out what's going on. And it may very well be that it's the idea that this man is going to be manipulated by the council and he's going to be used in order for them to be able to kill Paul. And he's not going to let that happen. And so he says, you don't tell anybody what you've told me. And so they don't know that the commander knows what they are going to do.
And it is an extraordinary sequence of events here that this, like you said, this information's found, that anything is done about it, and that Paul's life is seemingly going to be protected here. Because I would normally think if here's a guy that's arrested, what does the commander care about all of this? But now there is the fact, too, that if there is a sizable Jewish uprising of some type, that was his job, was to make sure those type of things didn't happen. Mm-hmm. And if he's got to protect a Roman citizen in this, then he does have some responsibility. But I think a lot of it may hinge on the fact that he's already messed up in the way that he treated Paul to begin with. And now he has information. He can't let that continue or he could really get in trouble. So he's going to take some precautionary measures here. Anything through verse 22? I would say this. I would think it would always be appropriate to try to work within line of God's promises. When you were saying that, I was thinking of Abraham. And with Abraham, I think that he probably thought he was working in line with God's promises, but he wasn't. If he would have listened carefully to the promise, I think he would have realized, wait a minute, I'm doing something else out of line here. So how do you know the difference on that? I wouldn't know how. I mean, in my own life, the only way that I know is to listen very carefully to what the promise of God is and to make sure that I'm not doing anything that would be out of step with that. So
it would never be appropriate to disobey God in order to ensure that one of His promises would come true. So I think sometimes people act that way. They say, well, this can't happen if I don't take matters in my own hand. And in that sense, do something other than what God has instructed. And so I think anytime, we have promises. Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, all these things will be added unto you. So what do? We go to work, right? We don't take that to mean, well, you're exempt from any responsibility there. But what we would not do is say, well, I've got to steal in order to feed my family. And maybe that's an extreme example, but what I would say there is that we might feel like we justify ourselves in that and say, well, maybe this is God's way of providing for me. And if it causes us to break God's word, it is not His way of providing for us, no matter what we think. Or maybe God wants me to have joy. I think He does. And we say, well, this relationship is what brings me joy. Well, it doesn't. It's not in line with God's will. Then it can't be the way that God's fulfilling that promise. And so what I would say about this situation is Paul's not doing anything that violates God's will by communicating this. I think you're right that God providentially will work however He needs to in order to do that. But I don't know. Did we answer it at all? Okay. We did answer it, whether it was accurate or not. That's a different thing.
So here's what the commander does in verse 23. He calls for 2 centurions, saying, prepare 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night and provide mounts to set Paul on and bring him safely to Felix the governor. So he's going to send him to the Roman capital of Judea, which is Caesarea. And he's sending a pretty sizable army to go with him and protect him. Remember, there were more than 40 men who said, we're not going to eat or drink until he's killed. And how many men does he send to protect Paul? Yeah, 200 plus. And so, quite a few here and going to protect him. And they're leaving at night, and they're doing this to get him out of town before any of this has time to transpire.
I think it ends up being 470, right? You've got 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. So, yeah, you might think that's excessive, but, I mean, the Claudius Lysias here is going to protect him. So, verse 26, we have this letter. This is from Claudius Lysias to the governor of the area, Felix. And I want you to notice the letter. Think back, remember the order of events, and then see how the letter corresponds to that. Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency the Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with the soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. All of those things happened, just not exactly in the order that Claudius Lysias says it, right? He comes and rescues him, not having learned that he is a Roman citizen. He learns that later. But anyway, that's beside the point for Claudius Lysias at this point. And desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. I found that he was being accused of questions about their law, but charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. And when it was disclosed to me that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him. So, because it wasn't safe here for him to be tried in their courts, I think is the idea, that there was no way he was going to get not only a fair trial, but he wasn't even going to make it to trial down here. He goes ahead and sends him to Felix away from the threat in Jerusalem. And in Caesarea, there would be more protection for Paul from the Roman courts and the Roman government, the Roman army, and all of that. And so, Claudius Lysias is kind of covering himself here in this letter by saying the reason he rescued him in the first place is because he was a Roman citizen. However, he does get Paul to Felix, and there's some protection there. Maybe he's just covering himself all over the place, but there is some concern on Paul's part anyway from him.
I think it's interesting that his name is listed here. Luke records the letter as it would have been written. And so here we have a Roman commander, and we know his name. And as Steve was saying, God is using him to protect Paul. And ultimately, this will be the first step in Paul getting to Rome. But first, he's just got to get to Caesarea. And Caesarea is about 70 miles away from Jerusalem down here. And so they leave the 3rd hour of the night. And it says that the soldiers, as they were commanded, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris, which is going to be about right here, so nearly halfway. And then at that point, what happens? Verse 32. Yeah, so he continues on horseback with the horsemen, and then the rest return back to the barracks. And so they leave in the middle of the night with 470. They get to Antipatris, and let's see, 270 of them return.
Yeah, 270 go back, and 200 horsemen 70 horsemen keep going.
Okay,
400
there
return back.
Yeah. And so then they continue on their way the next day, going to Caesarea. 70 miles in 2 days by horseback. That's moving along. And there was some urgency in this to get him there and to get him there safely.
Okay, so in verse 34, present the letter, verse 33. On reading the letter, he asked what province he was from, having learned that he was from Cilicia, so Tarsus was in Cilicia. He said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive, and he commanded to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. So, as we close chapter 23, what we're waiting on is accusers from Jerusalem to come and present their case that they have against Paul.
All right, so first century Caesarea has been preserved pretty well by the beach sands. For centuries, it was under the sand. Other cities had been built on top of it, but that sand had protected the first century city, and so a lot of that's been unearthed. You see the Hippodrome right here. You see the amphitheater right here. By the way, we have heard stories about the amphitheater there. Remember in Acts chapter 12, where Herod spoke and the people said, "Oh, the voice of a God and not a man." And the Lord struck him. That took place in that theater right there. But this right here was Herod's palace. This is his royal residence. And right outside of that, all of this area right here would have been the area that archaeologists believe that Paul was kept in. This was Herod's praetorium. As a matter of fact, we'll show this. I'm sure we'll come back to another slide later on. But this room right here was the courtroom. And it's going to be in that courtroom that they would assume would make his appearances before the governor and the king and so forth there. So it's pretty interesting. This is one of the places where we would know with some degree of certainty that Paul would have been in a few hundred square feet of a given area here. And we still have the foundation floor of that building that he would have been in.
All right, so anything else through chapter 23? I think we can just get started in chapter 24. We won't be able to make it all the way through, I don't think. But I want to kind of set up the context here with verse 1. And after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and a spokesman, one Tertullus. So Tertullus is going to be the lawyer that is going to present the Jewish case against Paul. They laid before the governor their case against Paul, and when he had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, Since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation, in every way and everywhere we accept this with all gratitude. But to detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly. Okay, so what do you notice about verses 2 through 4 about the way Tertullus introduces this? Well, he's trying to get on his good side. He is trying to butter him up, isn't he? Now, do what? Very polite, yes. We enjoy much peace through your excellent foresight. So Josephus said about Tacitus, a Roman historian, said of Felix that he had the power of a king and the mind of a slave. And he did not mean that as a compliment in any way, right? Here's a man who was limited in his capacity to make decisions, but who they entrusted with all this authority of a king. And from what we can tell about Felix and his history, he was ruthless and he was not particularly capable. And so all of this by Tertullus, it seems that it's not just that he's really talking about all of the good things Felix has done. That there weren't that many good things to talk about Felix and what he had done. That the peace and the foresight that Tertullus is talking about here probably was not really reflective of what Felix had contributed to the nation.
So you don't think the Jews in private talked about Felix this way?
Oh, no, I don't think so. No.
I don't know that they talk about any Roman governor this way, but
that's
certainly not Felix.
Yeah. So look at this in verse 5. We have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world, is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. By examining him yourself, you'll be able to find out something from him about everything of which we accuse him. So there are 3 major charges. I think Paul responds to those 3 charges pretty much in that order in his response beginning in verse 10. So notice those 3 charges. One who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world. Can you see why that accusation might have some stick to it? I mean, we talk about Ephesus, we talk about Thessalonica, we talk about Corinth. There have been, and then in Jerusalem. So whether or not Paul is at fault, you can certainly say that there have been riots that have been around him. That he's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Well, the Jewish religion had kind of an acceptance among the Romans, whether or not they liked it. It had been kind of grandfathered in through their process. But a new sect growing up out of that, who knows what this might hold for the Romans. And so there was a danger presented by that. And then he even tried to profane the temple, which the Romans even granted the Jews protection of the square footage around the temple, that they would uphold the rules for temple sanctity that the Jews had. And so that would be a capital offense if, in fact, Paul is guilty of that.
Interesting note here, a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. How have we seen Christians referred to in the Scriptures so far? By either Christians or their opponents? Of the way, yes. And why would they call it the sect of the Nazarenes? Jesus was from Nazareth, right? He was a Nazarene. What other significant things are from Nazareth? Nothing. Nothing that we know of. And so the fact that they follow someone from Nazareth was good enough to create a label from the sect of the Nazarenes here.
Yeah. Oh, okay, go ahead.
Yep. Verse 7. You may want to say something else before. You want to say anything else?
No, sir.
Okay. All right. So verse 7. The commander Lysias came and by great violence took him out of our hands. Because what were we doing? We were just trying to bring him to an orderly court where his case could be heard fairly and honestly. They were beating him to death. And so you kind of see how things are spun here all the way around. And so verse 8, commanding his accusers to come to you, by examining him yourself, you may ascertain all these things which we accuse him. And of course the Jews who came with him assented to this and say, yeah, that's right. And so,
yep. All right, so that's the accusation. So I think we probably should save Paul's response for next time, and he'll respond to those accusations. Anything else that you would like to say? We have just a minute if there's any questions or comments that you might have.
All right. Well, thank y'all.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.